economics, foreign policy, and national security are deeply interconnected. The events of the intervening few years have proved the point. Think of the pandemic and the resulting supply chain shocks. Think of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine and the way the tools of economic statecraft have been deployed by the G7 to respond. This center, through our research, our convenings, our fellowships with young economists, has sought to be the place that delivers new solutions for the challenges of our time. In fact, it was on this very stage 2 years ago that US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen delivered her friendshoring speech, just before the IMF World Bank annual meetings. She called upon all of us to channel the spirit of Bretton Woods, to remember that 44 countries met in New Hampshire not after war, but during war, 6 weeks after D-Day. She said at the time that they sought to build the future they hoped to win. And so the IMF and the World Bank, to us, are the quintessential geoeconomic institutions. They are proof that even in crisis, international collaboration works and can deliver something better than what came before. And there is no one who more embodies that principle than our guest today. Time and again, over the past 2 decades, President Lagarde has been called upon to lead in extraordinarily difficult moments. In 2007, she became French finance minister, the first time a woman was appointed as G7 finance minister. Only months into the job, she helped not just her country, but the rest of Europe and her counterparts here in the US navigate the global financial crisis. In 2011,
En directo, Christine Lagarde, la presidenta del Banco Central Europeo, en un acto que tiene lugar en las perspectivas económicas mundiales del Fondo Monetario Internacional. Christine Lagarde, que es una de las invitadas a este foro y en el que se espera que dé información sobre las medidas recientes del Banco Central Europeo en materia de tipos de interés, así como sus perspectivas de inflación en la zona euro. Una charla informal que comienza en estos momentos y que es moderada por la persona que ven en pantalla, Frederick Kemp, presidente y director ejecutivo de Atlantic Council.
He came with high recommendation from me.
I salute to Josh and his remarkable geoeconomics team. Another amazing week you're putting together. And you're putting it together as we dismantle our offices here. Good morning to all of you for this, our last major event at our old headquarters. We're already moving into our new headquarters at 1400L. I think you're going to be amazed at the new convening space. And good afternoon in Europe, good evening in Asia, hello all over the world. We've got people tuning in all over the place because they want to hear what you have to say. If you have questions, we're going to do them online today. All those in the audience live here can send them in through your phone if you like. And it's askac.org. Send it to askac.org. Let me get started with monetary policy, which seems like the right place to start with you. And I'm really interested in a situation where you're looking at inflation coming down 1.8% in September. It was as high as 10.6% October 2022. So that's the good side. The bad side is growth is slow. In Germany, it could be negative this year, probably will be negative this year, and they're maybe on the edge of a recession. GDP outgrowth, growth outlook forecast under 1% for the Eurozone. As you weigh these factors, looking at future decisions, how do you weigh inflation coming down, but growth, which is a good thing, but growth being as slow as it is, which is not a good thing?
Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Josh, very much for your way too kind introduction, and it's really a pleasure being here. I was wondering whether you follow a tradition that is often observed, where when you leave a place, you allow anybody who is here for the last time to pick up something from the
That's the end of our program today.
No, but it's wonderful to be back at the Atlantic Council, and congratulations for having expanded so much the scope of your work and your research, bringing together geopolitics, economics, and security in under one single roof. Back to your question, and thank you for starting with monetary policy, because this is really my business. Yeah. So at the European Central Bank, we are driven by a mandate, which is pretty simple and straightforward, which has a primary objective, which says price stability. It's upon us to define what it is, and we have, in our last strategy review, defined it as 2% medium-term symmetric. So we first of all look at inflation, at prices. We dissect inflation as much as we can, and we try to distinguish what is sort of headline inflation, which is what is felt and resented sometimes by people, from what is permanent, from what is temporary, to really understand where it is heading and how our decisions on interest rates in particular are going to affect inflation. So that's what we look at primarily. But of course, and we are, at this point in time, we are rather satisfied with the progress made, because as you just mentioned, we started off back in October 2 years ago at a reading of 10.6 on average, and we are now below 2% for the moment. We have reasons to believe that it will move up again above 2% in the next few months, but it's really good progress that we have largely contributed to. Growth. So we are attentive to growth, of course, because it impacts on inflation. And it is that impact of growth on inflation that we are attentive to. It's different from the Fed. The Fed has this dual mandate of price stability, but also growth, economic activity, employment. The ECB does not have that. We have a primary mandate, which is price stability.
So let's get to European competitiveness and growth.
En directo acaban de escuchar a Christine Lagarde, la presidenta del Banco Central Europeo, defendiendo el doble mandato que tiene el Banco Central Europeo a preguntas del moderador sobre el crecimiento, esa ralentización especialmente de Alemania, pero a su vez también esa desaceleración de la inflación. Decía qué es lo que está más pendiente el Banco Central Europeo. Decía que en primer lugar la inflación, que progresa adecuadamente. Están muy satisfechos con los resultados que está mostrando y ha confirmado que la inflación, si bien está por debajo del 2%, espera que suba en los próximos meses y se sitúe ligeramente por encima del 2%, pero también ha reconocido que están muy atentos al débil crecimiento que se registra en el conjunto de la eurozona.
Report.
Well, first of all, his report is comprehensive, analytical, documented, and as I said, a severe but just diagnosis of where Europe is. From my position as president of the central bank, I'm particularly attentive to three directions that he's identified. The first one, because they matter for monetary policy. So the first one is productivity. Europe lags in productivity way behind the United States. Just to give you a number, between 1995 and say 2020, US productivity has increased by 50%. Europe productivity has increased by 28%. So Europe is lagging behind in terms of productivity. That's objective number one. Improve, catch up, and identify which sectors are going to drive productivity. When you look at the gap between 50 and 28, you see that a lot of that results from the tech sector. Very obvious. Second item, which he also identifies, is energy costs and what can Europe do about it. If you look at the price of energy, it's about 2 or 3 times higher in Europe than it is in the US. If you look at the price of gas, it's 4 to 5 times higher in Europe than in the United States. So are we suddenly going to find oil, find gas? Do we actually want that? No. What he identifies as the way forward is rapid and smart decarbonization of the economy so that Europe can lead in terms of non-fossil energies, where we are a little bit ahead of the game, with caveats, but which would lead to a much cheaper source of energy once the investments are made, once the transition is completed, and which would also be a good way to adapt to the climate change impacts that we are suffering more and more by the day. The third dimension, which he identifies as well, is digitalization of our economies. And that is one where the productivity gap is obvious and where a collective endeavor by the Europeans is called for. What is needed behind it and why does it matter to us as, in terms of monetary policy, is the financing. To progress in digitalization, to move into the innovation journey that is needed for that, you need capital. And you need capital that is prepared to take risk. This is not something that we are very good at in Europe. If you look at the volume of venture capital that is raised in Europe, it's minimal relative to what is raised in the US or even China. So he advocates, and I have advocated before that myself, for a capital market union that is common to all, at least countries of the euro area, if not the whole of the European Union. And for that, we need a single integrated market from a regulatory point of view, from a supervision point of view, with common trade and post-trade infrastructure, where we are completely scattered all over. So those are the three directions where it matters to us. Improve productivity, of course it matters to us, especially with an aging population as we have it in Europe. Cheaper energy, of course it matters because it's clearly one of the domain that can shock our economies and has shocked all our economies, but Europe in particular recently. And digitalization, because there will be productivity improvement as a result as well.
So coming back to the core question behind this, how worried are you about it? We've known that these things need to be.
En directo, Christine Lagarde mostrando algunas de las prioridades que comparten con el informe Draghi, como una mayor industrialización o una mayor productividad en el conjunto de la zona euro. También, por supuesto, la descarbonización y abogar a completar la unión del mercado de capitales.
Because yes, those things have been identified probably in a more piecemeal way. One of the great values of the excellent Draghi report is that it brings it all together by someone who's been in all positions. National central banks, so he knows about the territorial aspects of some of the reforms. He's been president of the European Central Bank before me, so he knows how bringing everyone together is necessary and relies also on other unions than just monetary union. And he's been president of a prime minister of Italy, so he appreciates the politics that is behind it. So value is comprehensive by somebody who has a holistic view of the issues. He doesn't go, in my humble view, deeper enough into the action list, what needs to be done. And that's probably not, this is now going into the weeds and rolling sleeves up and getting the job done. But this is what the European leadership at all levels of institutions will have to do. How do you go about a capital market union? What do you need to tackle first? Who do you need to bring around the table to say, okay, you have your territory at the moment. It's not a question of taking it away from you, but bringing it to a level where major operations, major issuance will be taken at a different level. So all this needs to be done, and the urgency of the matter is now.
Thank you for that very clear statement. So we don't want to turn this into a press conference. That's not the purpose of the Atlantic Council, but I do have one follow-up question on your first answer from Mark Conahan. Is it appropriate for markets to begin pricing in aggressive rate reduction path in anticipation of poor economic data, even when the ECB's forecasts seem more sanguine, and this really gets to the point that if you look only at the inflation data, you may go in one direction. It's not your mandate to look at the economic data, but you've said how much it's linked. I think the real question behind this is, are you being too sanguine?
What we have done since last June, on the basis of the data that we had and our baseline, we have gradually cut interest rates once in June, then we held in July, then we cut again in September, and we cut again in October. So we do not have a linear, systematic sequence that would be, the way to go. We have reiterated many times, and I'm happy to do it again because it's really the way it works. We are data dependent, and we look at everything that's available, and we analyze those data on the basis of 3 key criteria, which include the inflation outlook, the underlying inflation, and the transmission of monetary policy. And when we last cut in October, we were confident on the basis of the data that we were receiving and observing that the disinflationary path was underway and that we could continue to dial back the restrictive monetary policy that was in place, that is in place. But of course, we need to be cautious. We need to be cautious because data will come up and will indicate to us what is the state of the economy, what is the state of inflation, of underlying inflation. And there will be a judgmental aspect to our decisions, but we will indeed have to be cautious in doing so.
Thank you for that. So from the immediate to the generational question, you delivered a truly fascinating speech last month at the IMF, and you said central bankers today, and any of you
En directo,
read it, you should
Christine
go and read the whole
Lagarde
thing.
hablando del ritmo
As you know,
en
I'm
la
an amateur
política
historian as well
monetaria
as
por parte de
a
la
think
entidad y
tank
defendiendo las
leader.
decisiones
But
que tomaron en el mes de
you
junio.
talked about
Recordaba
how
que no es
central
una línea
bankers today have better
sistemática
tools to
y
manage structural
que
changes in the
son data
1920s,
dependientes
even if some of the
en base a 3
headwinds are similar.
criterios: las previsiones
Here's
de
your quote.
inflación, la inflación
2 specific
subyacente y la
parallels between
transmisión de la
220s
política
and
monetaria.
1920s
Recuerda
and the
Lagarde que en
2020s, which I
octubre
found fascinating.
tenían
Now
mucha
we're seeing a
confianza en los
sound acting
datos,
global
en el
trade
ritmo de la
integration
inflación para aplicar esa política monetaria
and a stride
restrictiva,
toward
pero dice
progress
necesitamos ser cautos.
technological progress. So AI on the one side and decoupling, de-risking. I would add a third element to this that was there in the 1920s, which is a rising geopolitical risk. So we all know how the 1920s ended, which is the disasters of the 1930s, whether it was the Great Depression or whether in the end it was World War. What makes you more confident of our challenges today? If you're looking at the 1930s versus the potential 2030s, how do we avoid wrong turns at this point?
Okay. Well, each one of us has to do what one has to do. So you are the historian, and you can do the sort of geopolitical comparative analysis between the 30s back then and the 30s now. I will not venture in that area because I have to focus on what impacts monetary policy, and you would take me into too political a direction. But what gives me more confidence today, maybe it's twofold. One is, if you look at trade, back in those days, in the 20s, trade went down significantly. In a couple of decades, trade went down by 20%, down. The numbers we have on trade are not downwards, they are up. So if you look at the forecast by the IMF for the next couple of years, it's an increase of trade. I think it's 3.1 next year and 3.4 the year after. So we are not in a world where trade stops and trade declines. We are in a world where trade continues, but it continues in a different way. And And I think we have to be attentive to the composition and the distribution. So no less trade, but trade with other partners. Trade in a different risk distribution, if you will. It's the whole, strategies of corporates to have China +1 or to have +1. But certainly to continue to use the world in order to benefit from elasticity or in order to benefit from a larger market outside home base. So I don't think that trade is here to go on the basis of the information we have and the analysis that we can conduct. I think the second reason I'm more optimistic is that central banks in those days, they exacerbated the problems because they were operating within a rigid framework. And I think that we don't have that rigid framework anymore. I mean, the gold standards and the reference that currencies had vis-a-vis each other with gold as the standard is no longer with us. And we have invented over the course of the last few decades a much more flexible system, which allows for that room to maneuver in a less brutal and rigid way on the economies. Second, still in that monetary toolbox that we have, and the way that framework is organized, inflation expectations is one of the major compass that is being used in order to make sure that inflation comes back to that target that most of us around the world have of 2%, more or less. So those are two reasons in my field that give me hope that those 20s, where there are interesting similarities in terms of decline of trade and massive technology breakthrough, will not give rise, I hope, and I'm sure you do as well, Fred, to the 30s.
Yeah, thank you for that, because the saying, those who forget history are condemned to repeat it. I hope you're right. I'm going to ask for a visual aid here from our AV team, because I'm going to talk here about central bank digital currency, which I know is something of a passion of our Geoeconomics Center here. We've studied central bank digital currencies closely. What you're seeing right now is one of our most just tells you what geeks. Well.
Christine Lagarde, la directora gerente, la presidenta del Banco Central Europeo, hablando y haciendo una reflexión sobre la evolución del comercio en el presente milenio. Reconoce que en la década de los 20 el comercio se ha debilitado, pero no estamos en un comercio completamente parado, continúa, pero de distinta manera. Dice, tenemos que comprender cómo funciona porque hay más socios, hay una redistribución de los riesgos, y para nada piensa que el comercio se haya ido, y también rompe una lanza a favor de los bancos centrales. Dice, hay que ser optimistas porque los bancos centrales han operado con rigor, con rigidez y con estructura, y por ello hoy tenemos un sistema más flexible.
¿Cuál? So your second one, it was
the first one is how are you going to make a decision to go.
Yeah.
The second is what is the sovereignty issue, and the third is how does the U.S. play?
Okay. I might start with your second question because I'll tell you where we are. So we are, as you rightly said, in the what we call the exploratory phase, and it's a phase that will finish at the end of 25. So we have still 1 year to go. And at the end of 25, provided that the legislative process is completed, then the Governing Council of the Euro system will decide to launch for real or not. Why do I say the legislative process? Because digital, central bank money should be digital as well. And there are countries in Europe where banknotes are hardly ever used. So we need to have that anchor established in a digital way. I think the second reason we are doing that is the fact that payment systems are not exactly sovereign, and more to the point, they are very fragmented. In Europe, if you want to pay digitally, there are at the moment 13 countries that are operating in an isolated manner and which are not linked to the rest of the system. Having a digital euro is a way to actually bring that together on the back of whatever infrastructure will be available, but which will essentially facilitate peer-to-peer, point of sales, off hours payment between people in the trade, people between themselves in a cheap, fast, transparent manner. That's the objective that we have. And I think it's, if you look after your currency, it's also a way to really establish your sovereignty, which is what we're all doing.
Well, let's drill down on the sovereignty issue. Ananya Kumar from our team is asking about the parallel conversations happening about undercutting the international role of the dollar and the euro at the BRICS summit this week. How do you view the geoeconomic role of the digital euro within this context? And perhaps we could add the digital dollar to that, but your business is a digital euro.
Yeah. So I think here we're touching on two different things. One was the digital euro, which I tried to explain, and which we are working on, will continue to work, and will hopefully launch at the end of 25. I think what is also important is linkages between payment systems. Because at the moment we have too fragmented a payment system around the world, as a result of which, if, for instance, people want to remit money back home, and it is the case for a lot of migrants who are working away from home and want to send their salary back home, it takes forever, it's very expensive, it does funny loop-the-loop circuits around the world for some countries. So interlinking payment systems so that people can actually transact easily and cheaply and transparently, so that remittances can go back to the Philippines or to Thailand or to Mexico in a smooth and cheap way. That is important. And it's the reason why we in Europe, we have a system which is called Target Instant Payment System, which applies to retail transactions and which within Europe work in that fashion: fast, cheap, transparent. And yesterday, or a couple of days ago, we announced that we were prepared to link that TIPS, this instant payment system, with other instant payment systems around the world. And they are blossoming. And I would like to pay tribute to your CBDC tracker, which is really elaborate and top quality. But I think it would be interesting to also track the instant payment systems that are blossoming around the world. If you look at India, if you look at Brazil, if you look at Europe, we are heading in that direction. And it's a system that should not be closed off or restricted to the G7 countries, for instance. It's a system that has vocation to open up to multi-countries around the world in order to serve consumers and people who transact in the best possible ways, in the cheapest way, and to introduce a good competition.
Fascinating. And obviously you can't comment or instruct the U.S. what to do on its own digital currency. We seem to be a little bit behind on that.
Comment on it. But I think we need to be really attentive to developments around the world. We publish annually the international role of the euro. That's an ECB annual publication, and we follow, in which currency people transact, in which currency they keep reserves at the central banks, in which currency they do trade finance. And the role of a currency should never be taken for granted. Now, of course, the dollar has that dominant role and has had it for a long time. It's the exorbitant role of the dollar that Giscard d'Estaing, the former president of France, had identified. And the dollar is at around 50% of all those transactions when the euro is just below 20%. But we have to be attentive and careful. And there are phenomenon of rising movements concerning gold, notably. I mean, China has been buying gold like never before. Russia is supporting gold because it is extracting a lot of gold out of its underground. And there are clearly attempts to push other currencies. The renminbi is neck to neck with the euro on trade finance. So I think we all need to be attentive to developments. We all need to be attentive to new technologies. We need to listen to our customers and our compatriots to see what will serve them best, with the concern of defending the currency, establishing the sovereignty as it should be by legitimate means, but clearly defending finance.
That's an excellent answer. Thank you. So let's talk a bit about Russia and its immobilized reserves. 6 months ago, at the last IMF World Bank meetings, we'd been through several months of negotiations between the US and EU on the use of $300 billion of frozen Russian reserves. G7 announced in Italy brought forward interest income into a $50 billion payment, though not yet delivered. And it seemed like something is a breakthrough. The CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, I think it was back in April, you were talking about how freezing assets is different than confiscating assets and the global legal consequences of that. How do you view this new idea? What role would the ECB play now in getting the 50 billion plan over the line?
Okay, maybe let me describe what the new idea is so that we all understand what the difference is with the old idea. So the new idea that is being discussed is to use the interests generated by those frozen, not confiscated, frozen assets. Right. So this interest generated by the frozen assets that actually belong to the CSD, Euroclear, and to use that in order to serve the debt of Ukraine vis-a-vis the European Union, Japan, the US, the UK. And this is, and of course, Canada, I don't want to forget anyone in that game, but yeah, Canada is also part of the proposal. So it's very different from confiscating the capital. What I think the analysis is, the interest generated do not belong to Russia. They're generated by the capital. The links between the CSD and Russia did not provide for any attribution or ownership of those interests, as a result of which it is in the books and in the accounts of the CSD, Euroclear, and can be used for the purpose that is intended by the lenders. So that's really what is at stake. And I think it's vastly different from saying, we confiscate your assets. No, there's no such thing. Assets are frozen. They will remain frozen as long as is determined by those who made the decisions. And the interest generated that do not belong to Russia, but to the CSD, are used to serve the debt that is given to Ukraine.
So you're comfortable with that approach? It sounds like we're at war. Ukraine's at war. This is ongoing. Why can't it move faster? And what would be the ECB role in this?
It has moved. I think it was 2 days ago that the European, I think it was the Parliament or the three institutions together have actually decided to issue the loan, which the exact amount, I can't remember, I think it's 30 billions, that is backed, guaranteed, if you will, in terms of debt services by the interest generated as such. And I know that other G7 countries are moving in that direction. I think the UK is fairly advanced as well. And I don't know about the US. You'd have to ask Janet.
Let's go back to U.S. and China and trade. You talked. It's one of the overwhelming themes of this week, and so on the one hand, you have European U.S. tariffs, the danger of potential of more. On the other hand, you have
La presidenta del Banco Central Europeo, Christine Lagarde, preguntada por esas sanciones que Estados Unidos anunciará la próxima semana contra Rusia y también defendiendo ese paquete de ayuda a Ucrania. Puntualizaba la presidenta del Banco Central Europeo que no están confiscando ningún tipo de activos a Rusia, sino simplemente están beneficiándose de esos rendimientos de los activos congelados rusos, apoyando esa medida en el seno de la Unión Europea.
With each other, meaning essentially the WTO rules, is beneficial for innovation, it's beneficial for the development of the activity, has proven extremely good for some countries that have managed to reduce poverty as a result of extended activity and development of the economy as a result of trade being the major driver. And I think that we all stood to benefit from trade in many respects. So trade barriers, whether they are tariff or non-tariff barriers, are likely to have a negative impact on that, on growth, certainly, on, I think it would have an impact on inflation as well, and not one that would be particularly welcome. There is clearly overcapacity in certain sectors in China, and we have to remind our partners that there are rules by which we trade, which they have consented when they joined the WTO, and that they have to abide by. And that not being the case, then decisions have to be made. But I think that jumping to the conclusion that the economy will fare better at home because we have a big market, simply because we will raise tariffs, I think is a bit of a far-fetched conclusion that I don't see in the history of large economies. Because when you look at that, you're a historian. When you look at that, it's pretty clear that periods of restrictions and barriers have not been periods of prosperity and strong leadership around the world. So whoever in this country is ultimately the president, I think should at least bear that in mind. The times when the United States has been in strong leadership and when the economy has been prosperous have most often coincided with periods of trade around the world and engagement of the country, because the US economy is such a large and powerful economy, and it has to project in the world on the global stage.
Thank you for that. I'm going to call for another visual aid, and this gets to the question of leadership at central banks and finance ministries. And we'd like to show you the disparity here between, this is our own data visualization, so the team is very good at this kind of thing. 12% of the world's finance ministers are female, 13% of the central bank governors. This is fact. You can see it on the chart very strongly. But are there implications for the global economy? Is this something we should fix just because it doesn't seem right? Or is there actually implications for the global economy in this visualization?
I think it's abysmally small and does not reflect the availability of talents and merits that many economists and macroeconomic experts and financial experts have around the world. So it does not, there's a whole pool of talent that is not tapped into and clearly not reflected on this chart. Thank you, by the way, for putting that in such colorful way.
And but
Christine Lagarde, refiriéndose a la brecha de género entre los actores macroeconómicos, le daban una estadística: tan solo el 12% de ministros de Economía en todo el mundo son mujeres. Recordaba Christine Lagarde que esto no refleja el talento ni el mérito en los expertos del ámbito macroeconómico a lo ancho y largo del planeta.
You should just learn that lesson and do it. Just do it.
Okay, thank you for that.
I know you do here.
Well, look, first of all, you look at the facts, and if the facts don't seem right, then you start, you change. The final question, and I don't expect you to prognosticate what will happen here in November or give a view on that, but we're the Atlantic Council. You're one of the most remarkable transatlanticists we know. You lived in the US for a long time. You have a great appreciation of this country and the Transatlantic Alliance. What message would you share with our American audience about how their decision now and through December 5th can impact not just Europe, but the rest of the world? I've had ministers of foreign countries complain to me that they don't get to vote in the US elections because they have so much at stake. But what do you think the stakes are in our own democratic process and elections?
I agree with them that a lot is at stake, actually. And the domestic decision that belongs only to the American people will have ramifications around the world in a very significant way. So it's not just a decision at home, although I understand the concern is much more at home and inflation and the economy and all that. But it has massive implications outside the United States because of what I just said. The United States is leading in multiple ways and has to deploy its leadership for the common good. That's what we should always keep in mind.
And maybe then let's put this a little bit of a different way. For Europe and the US to maintain their leadership role in this inflection point in history where we're going to be shaping the global future yet again together. From your standpoint, what you're doing, what do we need to do better together?
I think we need to remember what history has forged between us. And, I don't want to go back to Washington and Lafayette, but reading their letters, reading the letters that these two men exchanged and how they played a role in structuring that history which led to this extraordinary country should always be a reminder that in whichever position, in whichever situation, we need to be together. And I think that there are some bounds of history that is seen on the Normandy beaches, that is seen on the east coast of the United States that cannot go to waste. So we are together and we should stay in this together.
I think Washington and Lafayette is probably a good spot to close. So please join me virtually and also here in the audience in thanking Christine Lagarde, President of the European Central Bank, for this fascinating discussion.
Así concluye la comparecencia de Christine Lagarde, la presidenta del Banco Central Europeo, dejando algunos titulares, mostrando nuevamente esa retórica de que el Banco Central Europeo es data dependiente y deben ser cautos a pesar de los dos recientes recortes de tipos de interés que han justificado las decisiones del Banco Central Europeo.